Margaret Harrison never imagined that an ordinary Tuesday evening at Henderson's Market would become the defining moment of her distinguished 32-year judicial career. The humid August air hung heavy as she navigated the familiar aisles, her worn shopping basket in hand, following the same routine she had maintained for years. She had presided over thousands of cases, sentenced countless defendants, and built an unshakable reputation for fairness and incorruptible dedication to the law. But nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for the confrontation that was about to unfold in Aisle 7, or for the cascade of consequences that would follow from those 3 explosive minutes. The sound reached her first, a woman's voice, high and frightened, cutting through the mundane atmosphere of the grocery store. Then came the man's voice, loud and aggressive, slurred with alcohol and dripping with entitlement. Margaret set down her basket without hesitation and moved quickly toward the disturbance, her instincts honed by decades in the courtroom immediately recognizing the tone of intimidation and threat. What she found when she rounded the corner was a scene that encapsulated everything she had spent her entire career fighting against. A young woman trapped, frightened witnesses frozen in place, and a drunk young man wielding his family's power like a weapon. Derek Coleman had the store clerk backed against the refrigerated section, his breath reeking of whiskey as he invaded her space with predatory confidence. The girl's name tag read Sophia, and she couldn't have been more than 19 years old, her hands held up defensively as Derek leaned in close, hurling obscenities and threats. Around them, other customers had stopped to watch, their phones out recording but nobody daring to intervene. The store manager hovered nearby, his face a mask of nervous indecision, paralyzed by the recognition of exactly who this drunk young man was and what it would cost to challenge him. Everyone in town knew Derek Coleman. More importantly, everyone knew what happened to people who crossed the police chief's son. Derek was in the middle of a tirade about his father's power, about how he could have Sophia fired with a single phone call, about how untouchable he was, when Margaret stepped forward and positioned herself directly between him and the terrified clerk. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the calm authority of 3 decades spent commanding courtrooms, but there was steel underneath that composure. She ordered him to step back, her tone leaving no room for argument. Derek's bloodshot eyes took a moment to focus on her, and when they did, his response was a cruel smile and a slurred insult, dismissing her as just another old woman who needed to learn her place. He invoked his father's power, the network of influence and fear that had protected him his entire life, the connections that had made charges disappear and witnesses recant their statements 4 separate times before he'd even turned 21. When Margaret identified herself as Judge Harrison and gave him a direct order to leave the store, something flickered in Derek's expression, perhaps a moment of recognition, a brief calculation of consequences. But the alcohol had drowned whatever remnants of good judgment he might have possessed, and the lifetime of getting away with everything had left him incapable of recognizing real authority when it stood in front of him. His response was to laugh in her face, to tell her that his father owned the town and probably owned her too, and then to reach out to physically shove her aside. It was in that moment, when his hand moved toward her, that Derek Coleman made the biggest mistake of his life and set in motion a chain of events that would bring down an empire of corruption that had stood unchallenged for 15 years. Margaret caught his wrist mid-motion with surprising strength, her grip firm and unyielding. Her voice dropped lower, harder, carrying a promise rather than a threat. She informed him with perfect clarity that he had just committed assault on a judge in front of multiple witnesses, that he had exactly 2 choices right now: walk out immediately or be arrested and brought before her in court the next morning. Derek's face flushed with rage and humiliation, and he yanked his wrist free while invoking his father's name like a magical incantation that could undo what he'd just done. But Margaret cut him off with words that would echo through the county courthouse for years to come, telling him that his father had no authority over what happened in her courtroom, that connections and threats and reputation meant nothing there, and that he needed to think very carefully about His next move, for a brief moment, it seemed like Derek might actually walk away, might let his survival instincts override his pride. Then every entitled impulse from his consequence, free life came flooding back, and he took a swing at Margaret's face. She ducked easily, her movement economical and practiced, and Derek's momentum carried him forward off balance. She sidestepped smoothly, and he crashed into a display of canned goods, bottles clattering and rolling across the floor as he scrambled back to his feet, his face contorted with humiliation and fury. His response was more threats, more invocations of his father's power, screaming about how she was finished, how she was dead, how Chief Robert Coleman would hear about this and make her pay. Margaret pulled out her phone with deliberate calm and told him that his father would indeed hear about this, but he would hear it from her because she was calling the police right now, real police. Officers who understood that the law applied to everyone equally. She deliberately bypassed the city police department entirely and called Captain Jennifer Walsh, head of the county sheriff's department, knowing that anyone under Chief Coleman's command would find a way to make this incident disappear, just like all the others. While they waited for Walsh to arrive, Derek tried twice more to leave the store, and both times Margaret physically blocked the exit while the store manager locked the doors. The other customers continued recording on their phones, capturing multiple angles of Derek's escalating threats and obscenities, documenting every moment that would later prove crucial. When Captain Walsh walked in 8 minutes later with 2 deputies, she took one look at the scene and understood immediately the significance of what had happened. The sheriff's department had long resented the city police chief's corruption, the way he operated his department like a personal fiefdom, but they'd never had the leverage or the opportunity to challenge him directly. Until now, Walsh arrested Derek on charges of assault, attempted assault of a judicial officer, public intoxication, and disturbing the peace, her voice professionally neutral but satisfaction visible in her eyes. Derek's response was to throw another punch, this time at the captain, and within seconds, the 2 deputies had him on the ground in handcuffs. He was still screaming threats about his father's power as they loaded him into the patrol car, still unable to comprehend that this time would be different, that this time there would be actual consequences. Margaret approached Walsh and made her instructions crystal clear, every charge documented, every witness statement recorded, everything done completely by the book. Walsh nodded slowly and pointed out what they both knew, that Chief Coleman would come after Margaret with everything he had. Margaret's response was simple and unflinching: let him try. The phone calls started before Margaret even reached home, beginning with the mayor suggesting that perhaps the situation had been blown out of proportion, that young Derek had been going through a difficult time, that maybe they could resolve this quietly without all the publicity and official charges. Margaret declined politely but firmly, her tone making it clear this wasn't negotiable. Then came the district attorney, a man who owed his position partly to Chief Coleman's political support, calling to express his concerns about the optics of the case, carefully dancing around what he was really suggesting. Margaret's response was direct and unambiguous. The optics were simple. A repeat offender with a history of violent behavior had assaulted a store clerk and then a judge, and if he was suggesting they handled this differently because of the defendant's father's position, then he was part of the problem, and she would make sure that fact became part of the public record. The DA backed off quickly, but Margaret knew he would be reporting every word of their conversation directly to Coleman. The real assault came at 2 in the morning when Margaret was reviewing incident reports at her home office. Her personal cell phone rang, and the voice on the other end was cold and controlled, carrying the weight of 15 years of unchallenged power. Chief Robert Coleman began by suggesting they needed to have a conversation about the evening's events, his tone implying this was somehow negotiable. Margaret shut that down immediately, informing him that his son had committed multiple crimes in front of witnesses and would be arraigned in her courtroom the next morning, where he would face the same legal process as anyone else. Coleman's response revealed the methods he'd used to protect his son all these years, as he transitioned from veiled suggestions to unmistakable threats, telling her she was making a serious mistake, that he'd been in this town for 20 years, that he knew things about people, knew things about judges, that he could make her life very difficult. This was the moment Margaret had anticipated, and she was prepared. She pressed the record button on the second phone she had ready on her desk and asked him directly if he was threatening her, if he was attempting to interfere with the judicial process. Coleman tried to walk it back, framing his threats as helpful advice, suggesting that his son had made a mistake but didn't need jail time for a misunderstanding, proposing that they work something out with reduced charges and probation. Margaret pushed him to be explicit about what exactly he was proposing, and Coleman obliged by laying out a plan to minimize his son's consequences through the same corruption that had worked so many times before. When Margaret made it clear that his son's actions constituted felony assault, and there would be no special treatment, Coleman's voice hardened and he showed his true hand, mentioning Margaret's daughter Sarah by name, her job at a law firm in Seattle, suggesting it would be terrible if certain information came to light that might affect her career, perhaps information about who helped her pass the bar exam. Margaret's hand tightened on the phone, but her voice remained perfectly steady as she pointed out that he was now threatening her family, and then she asked him a question that changed everything. Did he realize she was recording this entire conversation? The silence that followed lasted several long seconds, filled with the weight of Coleman realizing he had just destroyed himself. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its confident edge, asking with disbelief if she was really recording him. Margaret confirmed that she was recording every word, including his attempts to bribe her, threaten her family, and interfere with the judicial process, and that she would be forwarding the recording to the state attorney general's office in the morning, along with a formal complaint. She suggested he hire a lawyer because he was going to need one. The line went dead. The arraignment the next morning was packed with spectators, reporters, and courthouse staff, word of the incident having spread through the community overnight, fueled by videos that witnesses had posted online. Derek Coleman appeared in an orange jumpsuit, looking considerably less confident than he had in the grocery store, his expensive defense attorney arguing strenuously for immediate bail reduction. Margaret denied the request, noting that the defendant had a history of violent behavior, had made threats against witnesses, and his father had attempted to interfere with the case, making him both a flight risk and a danger to the community. She set bail at $200,000, cash only. The courtroom erupted with gasps and objections, but Margaret's ruling stood. Then she did something that nobody in the courtroom expected. Something that would later be described as the most dramatic moment in the county courthouse's history. Margaret addressed the court directly and announced that she was issuing a warrant for the arrest of Police Chief Robert Coleman on charges of attempted bribery of a judicial officer, intimidation of a witness, and obstruction of justice. She instructed the bailiffs to coordinate with state police to execute the warrant immediately. The gasps from the gallery were audible. Derek's attorney went pale, and in the back of the courtroom, Captain Walsh smiled with satisfaction. It took 2 hours for state police to locate and arrest Chief Coleman. He came quietly, maintaining his composure in front of the cameras, but everyone who saw him could tell his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. The recording Margaret provided to the state attorney general's office proved devastating, and combined with years of whispered complaints, mysterious disappearances of evidence, and testimonies from officers who had been silenced or pushed out of the department, the investigation that followed uncovered corruption far deeper and more extensive than anyone had imagined. Chief Coleman had been running a sophisticated corruption network for 15 years, taking bribes from local businesses, fixing parking tickets for political allies, providing protection to certain criminal elements in exchange for information he could use against his enemies. He had built a web of compromised officers, intimidated prosecutors, and blackmailed officials, operating with complete impunity because everyone was too afraid to challenge him. He had perfected the art of making problems disappear, of turning the legal system that was supposed to serve justice into a tool for protecting his interests and his son. For 15 years, nobody had been willing to stand up to him. Nobody had been brave enough or principled enough to put their career and safety on the line to expose what everyone knew was happening. Until Judge Margaret Harrison decided that enough was enough, that the law had to mean something even when enforcing it came at personal cost. The trials that followed consumed 9 months of intense legal proceedings and media attention. Derek Coleman pleaded guilty to assault charges and received a 3-year prison sentence with mandatory substance abuse treatment, finally facing real consequences for his actions for the first time in his life. His father's trial proved longer and far more complex, involving dozens of charges and hundreds of pieces of evidence, painstakingly assembled by state and federal investigators. In the end, Robert Coleman was convicted on 14 counts of corruption, bribery, and obstruction of justice, receiving a 12-year sentence in federal prison. But the real significance of what Margaret had started went far beyond 2 individuals being held accountable for their crimes. The investigation exposed 6 other police officers who had participated in the corruption scheme, showing how deep the rot had spread through the department. It led to the resignation of 2 city council members and the mayor, all of whom had benefited from or turned a blind eye to Coleman's activities. It prompted a complete restructuring of the city police department under federal oversight, with new policies, new leadership, and new accountability measures. Most importantly, it opened the door for dozens of people whose cases had been dismissed or whose evidence had mysteriously disappeared to seek new trials or have their records cleared, giving them a chance at the justice they had been denied when Coleman's network was protecting his interests. Derek Coleman served 2 years of his sentence before being released on parole, and the time in prison changed him in ways that his father's protection and enablement never could have. He completed his substance abuse program, earned his GED, and began taking college courses online while incarcerated. After his release, he found work at a nonprofit organization that helped young people avoid the mistakes he had made, using his own story as a cautionary tale about privilege, accountability, and second chances. He would never forget that moment in Henderson's Market when Judge Harrison refused to look away, refused to let him walk away, refused to perpetuate the cycle of consequence-free behavior that had been destroying his life while everyone around him enabled and excused his actions. He came to understand that what felt like destruction at the time was actually salvation, that being held accountable was the greatest gift anyone had ever given him. Judge Harrison received numerous threats during the trials and afterward, anonymous phone calls and letters, even attempts to intimidate her daughters, efforts by Coleman's remaining allies to make her pay for bringing down their system. She never wavered, never showed fear, never regretted her decision. She increased her security, worked with federal marshals to protect her family, and continued to preside over her courtroom with the same fairness and unwavering commitment to justice she had demonstrated throughout her 3-decade career. 2 years after the incident, Derek Coleman requested a meeting with her, and she agreed to meet him in a neutral location with his parole officer present. He looked different when he walked in, older and sober, carrying himself with a humility that had been entirely absent that night in the grocery store. He told her quietly that he had come to thank her, acknowledging how crazy that sounded given that she was the reason he went to prison, but explaining that she was also the reason he wasn't dead in a ditch somewhere or worse, turning into his father. She was the first person in his entire life who had held him accountable, who treated him like his actions had real consequences. He admitted he had hated her for it at the time, but now he understood that it had saved his life. Margaret listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she spoke carefully and honestly. She told him she hadn't done it to save him, that she had done it because it was right, because the law had to mean something and apply to everyone equally, or it meant nothing at all. What he did with his second chance was entirely up to him, but she hoped he would make it count. As Derek stood to leave, he paused at the door and asked her to do something for him. He explained that he had tried to apologize to Sophia, the clerk from the store, but she wouldn't see him, and he didn't blame her for that. But if Margaret ever spoke with her, he wanted Sophia to know he was sorry, that he understood why she couldn't forgive him, and that every day he was trying to become the kind of person who would never have done what he did to her. Margaret did eventually speak with Sophia Rodriguez, who had quit her job at the grocery store the week after the incident and moved to another city to attend college. Sophia was studying criminal justice with plans to become a prosecutor, and she told Margaret that witnessing someone finally stand up to Derek Coleman, finally hold him accountable despite his father's power, had fundamentally changed her understanding of what justice could be and inspired her career choice. 3 years after that humid Tuesday evening in Henderson's Market, the changes continue to ripple through the community in ways both large and small. The new police chief, brought in after a national search, has implemented comprehensive transparency measures and community oversight programs. The district attorney's office, under new leadership, has reopened several dozen cases where evidence suggested interference or corruption during the Coleman era. The city council has passed new ordinances requiring independent investigations of all police misconduct allegations, creating systems designed to prevent any one person from accumulating the kind of unchecked power Coleman had wielded. The culture of fear and complicity that had allowed corruption to flourish has been replaced, slowly but surely, with a renewed commitment to accountability and the rule of law. Judge Margaret Harrison continues to preside over her courtroom, still driving her now 13-year-old Honda Civic, still doing her own grocery shopping, though she's had to change which store she visits, still making decisions based on law and evidence and the fundamental principle that justice must be blind to privilege and power. The story of what happened that night became national news, then international, sparking conversations about corruption in small town law enforcement, about the abuse of power by the connected and wealthy, about what happens when institutions designed to protect the public are compromised from within. But more than anything, it became a story about courage, about the choice to do the right thing when the cost might be enormous, when the threats are real and credible, when everyone else is looking away because challenging power seems too dangerous or too difficult. The lesson isn't just about one drunk young man or one corrupt police chief or even one brave judge. It's about all of us and the choices we make when we witness injustice happening right in front of us. It's about the moment when we decide whether to look away because intervening might cost us something, or to stand firm because some principles are worth defending regardless of the price. Margaret Harrison chose not to look away that evening in aisle 7. She chose to stand firm when standing firm meant putting her career, her safety, and her family's well-being on the line. She chose to believe that the law could still mean something if someone was willing to defend it against those who had corrupted it for their own benefit. And that one choice, made in 3 minutes on an ordinary Tuesday evening, changed everything for Derek Coleman, for Chief Robert Coleman, for Sophia Rodriguez, for dozens of people whose cases had been buried, and for an entire community that rediscovered what justice could look like when someone refused to let power and privilege stand above the law. The aftermath of Margaret Harrison's decision continued to unfold in ways that no one could have predicted, touching lives and transforming institutions throughout the county and beyond. The federal investigation that began with that recorded phone call metastasized into something far more comprehensive, reaching into corners of local government that had seemed safely insulated from scrutiny. Special prosecutors brought in from outside the state began interviewing everyone who had ever worked in or with Chief Coleman's department, and what they discovered painted a portrait of systematic corruption that had infected nearly every aspect of law enforcement and criminal justice in county. The investigation revealed that Coleman's protection of his son had been merely the most visible symptom of a much deeper disease. Financial records showed irregular payments flowing from local businesses to accounts controlled by Coleman and his associates, carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements, but unmistakable in their pattern and purpose. Prosecutors found evidence that Coleman had been running what amounted to a protection racket, offering certain establishments immunity from strict enforcement of building codes, health regulations, and zoning restrictions in exchange for regular contributions to what he called his community fund. Those who refused to participate found themselves subjected to aggressive inspections, mysterious complaints from anonymous sources, and citations for violations that had gone unnoticed for years when they were compliant. The drug evidence room became a particular focus of investigation when an audit revealed that substantial quantities of narcotics had gone missing over the years, replaced with substances of similar appearance, but no chemical value. Coleman had been allowing certain mid-level dealers to operate freely in exchange for information about their competitors and a share of their profits, while simultaneously using the confiscated drugs to set up rivals or individuals who had crossed him. The missing narcotics had been redistributed back onto the streets through carefully managed channels, creating a circular system where Coleman controlled both the supply and the enforcement, profiting from both sides while maintaining his public image as a tough-on crime police chief. Witness after witness came forward once the dam of fear had been broken by Margaret's courage. People who had been silenced for years, suddenly finding the strength to tell their stories. There was Marcus Chen, a former officer who had tried to report irregularities in evidence handling, and found himself facing fabricated internal affairs investigations until he resigned rather than face termination. There was Patricia Morales, a prosecutor who had pushed too hard on a case involving a Coleman family friend, and subsequently discovered that someone had been feeding details of her confidential case strategy to the defense, forcing her to withdraw and eventually leave the district attorney's office entirely. There was James Rutherford, a businessman who had refused to make the expected contributions to Coleman's fund and watched his restaurant fail after a suspicious string of health code violations and police responses that took hours to arrive when his establishment had problems. The human cost of Coleman's corruption became clearer with each new revelation. Families had been torn apart by prosecutions built on tainted evidence. Young people had been funneled into the criminal justice system for minor offenses, while others with connections walked free from serious crimes. Communities of color had been disproportionately targeted for aggressive enforcement, while wealthy neighborhoods enjoyed selective blindness to similar violations. The faith in institutions that should protect and serve had been systematically eroded by a man who viewed his badge and position as tools for personal enrichment and power consolidation rather than public service. Margaret found herself at the center of a media storm that she had never sought and handled with characteristic grace and firm boundaries. Reporters from national news organizations wanted interviews, documentary filmmakers wanted access, book publishers wanted her story. She declined almost all of these requests, maintaining that she had simply done her job and that the focus should remain on systemic reform rather than individual heroism. When she did agree to speak publicly, usually at legal conferences or judicial training sessions, her message was consistent and pointed. The system had failed not because of one corrupt individual, but because too many people at every level had chosen complicity over courage, had prioritized their careers and comfort over their oaths and obligations, had told themselves that someone else would speak up or that the problem was too big for one person to challenge. Her speeches made some people uncomfortable because she refused to let anyone off the hook, including her fellow judges who had quietly steered cases away from Coleman family interests, the prosecutors who had found reasons not to pursue charges they knew should be filed, the city officials who had accepted Coleman's version of events rather than asking difficult questions. She pointed out that corruption flourished in silence and shadows, that it required not just active participants but passive enablers, that every person who knew something was wrong and said nothing had contributed to the 15 years that Coleman operated with impunity. Her words stung because they were true, and they forced uncomfortable self-examination among people who had convinced themselves they were powerless or that their individual complicity didn't matter in the larger scheme. The political fallout continued for years after the initial arrests and trials. The mayor who had called Margaret that first night suggesting they resolve things quietly found himself facing a recall election that he lost decisively, his association with Coleman's regime proving politically toxic. The district attorney, who had expressed concerns about optics, chose not to run for re-election, recognizing that his compromised relationship with the police department had destroyed his credibility. 3 city council members resigned or were voted out in the next election cycle, replaced by reform candidates who ran explicitly on platforms of transparency and accountability. The entire power structure of the city underwent a transformation that political scientists would later study as a case example of how exposure of corruption at one level can cascade through interconnected systems. The new police chief, Sandra Washington, came from a major metropolitan department with an exemplary record and a reputation for implementing progressive reforms. She arrived with a mandate for wholesale change and the political support to actually accomplish it. Her first actions included establishing a civilian oversight board with real investigative authority, implementing body cameras for all officers with strict policies about when they must be activated, creating an early warning system to identify officers whose behavior patterns suggested problems before they escalated, and opening a direct line for community members to report concerns without going through the traditional chain of command. She personally reviewed every case from the Coleman era where questions had been raised about evidence handling or witness intimidation, and she established a victims advocacy unit specifically to help people whose lives had been damaged by corrupt practices seek remediation. Washington also made it a priority to rebuild trust with communities that had been most heavily impacted by Coleman's selective enforcement and predatory practices. She held town halls in neighborhoods that had been over-policed, listening to concerns and complaints without becoming defensive. She acknowledged explicitly that the department under Coleman had betrayed the public trust, and that words alone couldn't repair that damage, only consistent action over time. She worked with community leaders to develop new approaches to public safety that emphasized de-escalation and service rather than purely enforcement-focused models. The transformation was slow and difficult, meeting resistance from some officers who preferred the old ways and skepticism from community members who had been burned too many times to easily trust again. But Washington persisted with patience and determination. Derek Coleman's transformation during and after his incarceration became almost as remarkable as the exposure of his father's corruption. The prison environment, stripped of all the protective insulation that had surrounded him his entire life, forced Derek to confront himself in ways he had never been capable of before. He attended every counseling session, every substance abuse treatment group, every educational opportunity available to him. He read voraciously, everything from philosophy to psychology to memoirs of people who had overcome addiction and made meaningful changes in their lives. He wrote letters of apology to everyone he could remember harming, not expecting responses but needing to articulate his remorse and take ownership of his actions. The therapist he worked with in prison later described Derek as one of the most profoundly changed individuals she had encountered in her career. The arrogant, entitled young man who had entered the system truly believing that his father would somehow rescue him had gradually been replaced by someone who understood that he had been both perpetrator and victim, that his father's protection had been a form of abuse that prevented him from developing into a functional adult. Derek came to see that every time his father made charges disappear, every time witnesses were intimidated into silence, every time he faced no consequences for destructive behavior, it had reinforced the most toxic parts of his personality while stunting his capacity for empathy, responsibility, and genuine self-worth. His work with the nonprofit after release focused on young people from privileged backgrounds who were following similar paths of entitlement and consequence-free destruction. He spoke at private schools and in wealthy suburbs, telling his story without glamorizing or minimizing what he had done. He talked about how privilege had been poison when it came without accountability, how his father's corrupt protection had nearly killed him more surely than any drug he had ever taken. He described that moment in the grocery store when Judge Harrison refused to step aside, how he had been filled with rage and disbelief that someone would dare to hold him accountable, and how that rage was really terror because some part of him had known even then that his life was unsustainable and heading toward a catastrophic end. The young people he worked with, many of them teetering on the edge of similar patterns, responded to his authenticity and the fact that he had actually lived through consequences rather than just warning about them theoretically. Parents brought their troubled teenagers to hear Derek speak, hoping that his story might break through the denial and sense of invincibility their children exhibited. School administrators invited him to address students after incidents of bullying, vandalism, or substance abuse, recognizing that his message about privilege and accountability resonated in ways that traditional disciplinary approaches often failed to achieve. Derek never claimed to have all the answers, never presented himself as fully healed or beyond struggle, but his willingness to be vulnerable about his ongoing work to become a better person gave his message power. His relationship with his father remained complex and painful. Robert Coleman initially refused to see Derek during the first year of his incarceration, apparently unable to process that his son had pleaded guilty and accepted responsibility, rather than fighting the charges or waiting for him to somehow fix everything. When they finally did meet, at Derek's request, the conversation was difficult and emotionally raw. Derek tried to explain how his father's protection had harmed him, how being shielded from consequences had prevented him from growing up, how the corruption that had seemed like love was actually a form of control that kept him dependent and dysfunctional. Robert responded with anger and denial, insisting that he had done everything for Derek, that everything he had built and compromised and corrupted had been about protecting his son. That conversation ended badly, but Derek kept trying, kept writing letters and requesting visits even when his father refused them. He came to understand that his father was also a product of his environment, that Robert Coleman had likely grown up with his own traumas and distorted values that had shaped his choices. That understanding didn't excuse what his father had done, but it allowed Derek to hold both truths simultaneously, that his father had caused immense harm and that his father was also a damaged human being worthy of compassion. After 3 years, Robert finally began to soften, began to listen to his son's experiences and perspective, began the painful process of examining his own choices and their consequences. The reconciliation between them would be a lifelong work in progress, marked by setbacks and breakthroughs. But it represented a kind of healing that neither of them had believed possible in those first dark days after their arrests. Sofia Rodriguez's journey took her in directions she had never imagined before that terrifying night in Henderson's Market. The incident had traumatized her initially, leaving her with anxiety and nightmares, afraid to go to work, and eventually unable to continue in a job where she felt vulnerable and exposed. She moved away to attend college partly to escape the memories and the attention that came from being the victim in such a high-profile case. But as time passed and she processed what had happened with the help of therapy and supportive friends, something shifted in her understanding of the experience. She came to see that what Judge Harrison had done wasn't just about protecting one store clerk in one moment. It was about the principle that everyone deserved protection under the law, that justice wasn't supposed to be a commodity available only to the privileged, while the vulnerable were left to fend for themselves. Sophia had grown up in a working-class immigrant family, watching her parents navigate systems that often seemed designed to exploit people like them, and she had absorbed a sense of powerlessness about the way the world worked. Seeing Margaret Harrison stand up to Derek Coleman and his father's entire network of corruption shattered that sense of inevitability and showed Sophia that individuals could make a difference, that courage and principle could prevail against entrenched power. Her choice to study criminal justice and pursue a career as a prosecutor grew directly from that realization. She wanted to be someone who protected the vulnerable, who held the powerful accountable, who ensured that the system worked for everyone rather than just those with connections and resources. She excelled in her studies, driven by a clarity of purpose that many of her peers lacked. She sought out internships with prosecutors' offices known for integrity and reform, learning from mentors who shared her commitment to justice over conviction rates. She specialized in cases involving domestic violence and workplace harassment, areas where victims were often vulnerable and afraid to come forward, where institutional indifference could leave them without recourse. When she graduated law school and passed the bar exam, Sophia received multiple job offers from prestigious firms offering substantial salaries. She turned them all down and accepted a position with the district attorney's office in her home county, the same office that had undergone complete transformation in the wake of the Coleman scandal. She wanted to work where the reforms were happening, where the lessons of what had gone wrong were being translated into new practices and policies. Her colleagues quickly recognized her combination of idealism and pragmatism, her ability to empathize with victims while building legally sound cases, her unwillingness to cut corners or accept easy resolutions that didn't truly serve justice. 5 years after the grocery store incident, Sophia prosecuted a case that brought her full circle in unexpected ways. A prominent businessman's son had been accused of sexually assaulting a young woman at a party, and there were disturbing parallels to the old Coleman pattern. Witnesses changing their stories, evidence questions, pressure from powerful people to resolve things quietly. Sophia built her case meticulously, anticipating every attempt to undermine it. And when defense attorneys tried to intimidate the victim into dropping charges, she obtained protective orders and documented every contact. The trial was contentious and heavily covered by media, with many people watching to see if the reforms would hold, or if privilege would once again find a way to evade accountability. When the jury returned a guilty verdict, Sophia felt the weight of every person who had been denied justice under the old system, every victim who had been silenced or ignored or blamed. She thought about that 19-year-old store clerk who had been backed against the refrigerated section by a drunk man wielding his father's power like a weapon. She thought about Judge Harrison stepping forward when everyone else stayed back with their phones out. And she understood that her work was part of a continuum, that each case where justice prevailed made the next one easier, that each time someone with power faced real consequences, reinforced the message that the law meant something for everyone. Margaret Harrison attended Sophia's swearing. In ceremony when she joined the prosecutor's office, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom as the young woman took her oath. Sophia spotted her afterward and made her way through the crowd of family and friends to thank her for coming. They spoke for only a few minutes, but Sophia told Margaret that she thought about that night in the grocery store almost every day, that it had shown her what courage looked like and inspired everything she was trying to accomplish in her career. Margaret listened with characteristic humility, and then said something that Sophia would remember forever. She said that courage wasn't the absence of fear or the presence of some special quality that only certain people possessed. It was simply the decision to do the right thing even when doing so was difficult or dangerous, the choice to act according to your principles even when the cost might be high. Anyone could make that choice in any moment, and the world changed one choice at a time. The ripple effects continued to spread in ways both large and small, touching people who had never met Margaret Harrison or Derek Coleman or Sofia Rodriguez, but whose lives were nonetheless shaped by what had happened in Henderson's Market that August evening. A young police officer in another county, hearing about the scandal and the reforms that followed, found the courage to report misconduct he had witnessed in his own department, triggering an investigation that led to significant changes. A prosecutor in a different state, following the coverage of the trials, reopened cases where she had felt pressured to accept plea deals that didn't serve justice, giving victims a second chance at holding their abusers accountable. A city council member, inspired by Margaret's example, began asking harder questions about relationships between his local police department and political establishment, uncovering patterns of favoritism that had gone unchallenged for years. The story became part of the curriculum in law schools and police academies, studied as both a cautionary tale about how corruption develops and spreads, and an inspiring example of how individual integrity can catalyze systemic change. Students analyzed the decision points where people throughout the system chose complicity over courage, discussing what factors led to those choices and how institutions could be structured to make the courageous choice easier and more supported. They examined Margaret's actions from that first moment in the grocery store through the trials and aftermath, identifying the principles and practices that had enabled her to stand firm against enormous pressure. Margaret herself became an inadvertent symbol, though she consistently pushed back against being elevated to hero status. She gave lectures where she emphasized that she had been positioned by circumstances and career to take the action she took, that she had resources and protections that many people lacked, that focusing too much on individual heroes could obscure the need for structural changes that didn't rely on exceptional individuals making extraordinary choices. She argued that the real lesson wasn't about her personal courage, but about building systems where doing the right thing was the default path, where corruption faced immediate consequences, where people who spoke up were protected rather than punished. Her judicial philosophy, always grounded in principle, became even more explicitly focused on accessibility and accountability. She implemented practices in her courtroom designed to make the legal process more understandable for people without lawyers, taking time to explain procedures and rights in clear language. She established a reputation for being absolutely scrupulous about disclosure requirements, making sure defendants and their attorneys received every piece of evidence that might be relevant to their cases. She pushed back against prosecutorial overreach while remaining tough on actual criminal conduct, threading the difficult needle between being soft on crime and being unfair to defendants. Her colleagues noted that she seemed even more energized by her work after the Coleman case, as if confronting corruption directly had renewed her sense of purpose and commitment. Coleman family's story became intertwined with discussions about criminal justice reform, generational trauma, and the corrupting influence of unchecked power. Some people viewed Robert Coleman as purely villainous, the architect of a system that had caused immense harm for personal benefit. Others saw his trajectory as emblematic of how institutions can corrupt individuals, how small compromises and rationalizations can accumulate over time into something monstrous. Derek became a symbol of both the damage caused by privilege without accountability and the possibility of redemption and change. Their story was messy and complicated, resistant to simple moral conclusions, which made it all the more valuable for genuine examination of how people become who they become and how systems shape behavior. The community itself underwent a transformation that went beyond changes in specific institutions. There was a renewed civic engagement, a sense that ordinary citizens had both the power and the responsibility to demand accountability from their leaders and institutions. Town halls that had once been sparsely attended now drew crowds, City council meetings featured robust public comment periods where residents asked pointed questions and expected real answers. Community organizations formed to monitor police conduct, court proceedings, and government transparency. The culture shifted from one of resigned acceptance that powerful people played by different rules to one of expectation that everyone would be held to the same standards. This didn't mean everything became perfect, or that corruption was permanently eliminated. There were setbacks and new challenges. People who tested the boundaries to see if the reforms would hold. Instances where old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But the difference was that now there were structures in place to catch problems early, cultural expectations that made corruption more difficult to sustain, and a recent, vivid example of what happened when corruption was exposed. Every official and officer knew the Coleman story, knew what had happened when one man believed himself above the law and others enabled that belief. That knowledge didn't guarantee good behavior, but it created a deterrent effect and made it easier for people to speak up when they saw problems. Judge Margaret Harrison retired from the bench after 38 years of service, 6 years after the incident that had defined the final chapter of her career. Her retirement was marked by ceremonies and tributes that she accepted with grace while gently redirecting attention toward the work that remained to be done. In her final address from the bench, she spoke about her faith in the law as an instrument for justice when wielded properly, and her recognition of its capacity to cause harm when corrupted or misapplied. She urged the lawyers, officers, and officials who would continue the work after her departure to remember that every choice mattered, that seemingly small compromises could accumulate into systemic failure, that courage was required not just in dramatic confrontations, but in daily decisions. Uphold principles even when doing so was inconvenient or costly. She spent her retirement doing pro bono work for organizations focused on criminal justice reform, serving on boards and advisory committees, mentoring young lawyers and judges who sought her guidance. She wrote articles for legal journals about judicial ethics, institutional corruption, and the responsibility of legal professionals to the communities they served. She remained a voice for principle and reform, speaking with the authority of someone who had faced real consequences for standing firm and emerged vindicated. Her influence extended far beyond the cases she had personally decided, shaping the next generation of legal professionals and reinforcing the message that the law was supposed to serve justice, not power. Derek Coleman, now in his early 30s, had built a life that bore no resemblance to the trajectory he had been on when he was 23. He had earned a college degree, married a woman he met through his work at the nonprofit, and become a father himself. The experience of raising his own son brought new dimensions to his understanding of his father's failures, the ways that Robert's own damaged relationship with accountability and consequences had been passed down and amplified. Derek was determined to break that cycle, to raise his child with clear boundaries, appropriate consequences, and unconditional love that didn't shield him from the natural results of his choices. It was harder than he had imagined, requiring constant self-examination and willingness to seek help when old patterns threatened to resurface. But he approached parenthood with the same commitment to change that had marked his recovery. He never forgot that night in Henderson's Market, and he never let himself off the hook for what he had done. The memory remained sharp and painful, a reminder of who he had been and how close he had come to destroying not just his own life, but others as well. He kept a photograph of himself from his arrest, looking drunk and belligerent and lost, displayed in his office where he met with young people. When they asked about it, he told the truth about that person, about the choices that had led to that moment, about the woman who had refused to let him continue down that path. He credited Judge Harrison with saving his life, but he was careful to explain that she hadn't saved him through kindness or second chances or understanding. She had saved him by holding him accountable, by refusing to enable his destruction, by insisting that his actions have consequences. That was the kind of love that actually helped, the kind that demanded growth rather than accepting stagnation. Sofia Rodriguez became one of the most respected prosecutors in the state, known for her preparation, her ethical standards, and her unwavering commitment to victims. She specialized in cases that others found too difficult or politically sensitive, taking on powerful defendants and building cases that could withstand the most aggressive defense strategies. She lost some cases despite her best efforts, and those losses haunted her, but she approached each one as if it were the most important case in the world, because to the victim it was. Her office became a destination for other young prosecutors who wanted to learn how to do the work with integrity, and she mentored them with the same combination of idealism and pragmatism that characterized her own approach. She and Judge Harrison stayed in touch over the years, meeting occasionally for coffee and conversation. Their relationship had evolved from victim and protector to professional colleagues to something like friendship, though there was always an element of mentorship, with Margaret offering perspective gained from decades of experience. They didn't talk often about that night in the grocery store, but it remained the foundation of their connection, the shared experience that had set both of their lives on new trajectories. Sofia sometimes wondered what would have happened if Margaret hadn't been there, if Derek had hurt her more seriously, if the clerk had been alone with a drunk assaulter and frozen witnesses. The thought was chilling, but it also reinforced her commitment to being someone who stepped forward rather than staying back, who acted rather than just recorded, who put herself on the line when situations demanded it. The anniversary of the incident became an informal day of reflection in the community, not officially recognized, but acknowledged by those who understood its significance. 10 years after that August evening, the local newspaper ran a retrospective piece examining how the county had changed, interviewing people whose lives had been touched by the scandal and its aftermath. The article traced the connections between that one confrontation and hundreds of subsequent changes: new policies, reformed institutions, different leadership, altered expectations, restored faith. It acknowledged that progress was uneven and incomplete, that new problems had emerged while old ones were being addressed, but it made clear that the trajectory of the community had fundamentally shifted because one judge had refused to look away when a drunk young man assaulted a store clerk. Margaret Harrison, now in her 70s, read the article with mixed feelings. She was pleased with the progress that had been made, gratified that her decision had contributed to meaningful change, but also concerned that the focus on one dramatic incident might obscure the daily, unglamorous work of maintaining institutions and upholding principles. She worried that people might think the story had an ending, that the corruption had been rooted out and now everything was fine, when the reality was that vigilance and courage would be required forever. Every generation would face its own temptations toward compromise and complicity, its own versions of Robert Coleman building networks of corruption, its own Derek Colemans testing the boundaries of accountability. The story wasn't really about what had happened 10 years ago. It was about what would happen tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, each time someone faced a choice between the easy path and the right one.